Welcome back, everyone, to the Mad Genius Thesis. We're diving back into a pretty fascinating area. That intersection of creativity and mental illness always seems to spark some interesting conversation and debate. And today, we're going to be looking at two artists. Two artists whose stories, I think, have really become kind of synonymous with this whole mad genius idea. We're talking Richard Dadd and, of course, Vincent van Gogh. But before we really get into their work, I got to share this story. I mean, it's a little dark, but when I first read it, it just sent chills down my spine. And I think it'll kind of set the stage for what we're talking about today.
Oh, yeah. I think I know exactly what you're talking about. Not exactly the most cheerful way to kick things off, is it?
No, not really. But it's powerful. So picture this. 1843, right? Summer evening, English countryside. Seems peaceful enough. Richard Dadd, who's already by this point, a pretty acclaimed artist, he's out for a walk with his father. Seems harmless enough, right? Except Dadd was convinced, absolutely convinced, that the Egyptian god Osiris was commanding him to do something absolutely unthinkable.
Yeah. It's definitely one of those stories that sticks with you.
Yeah.
And I mean, it really brings up that question, doesn't it? That age-old question about creativity and mental illness. I mean, is there really a connection? Is it just a coincidence that so many brilliant artists, throughout history have struggled with their mental health? Or is there something more? Is there a deeper link there?
And that is exactly what we're going to try to figure out today. And to help us do that, we're going to be using Insanity and Genius as our guide. I think this book, it gives us a really unique window into the minds of, Richard Dadd, of course, but also Vincent van Gogh, two artists, two very different lives, but both of them marked by, really profound mental illness and extraordinary artistic output. So we're going to look at how their mental health impacted their work, how their art reflected what was going on inside, their inner turmoil, and what their stories can tell us about, the human experience. It's complicated stuff.
Yeah, and I think before we really dive in, though, it might be helpful to define what we're talking about. When we say, the Mad Genius Thesis, because, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean? What are we really talking about here?
You're right. It's easy to just use these broad terms without really thinking about what they mean.
Yeah.
So to be clear, the Mad Genius Thesis isn't like, a hard science thing. It's not a scientific theory backed up by, tons of research. It's more of a cultural idea.
Right.
A trope, I guess you could say, that connects creativity with mental illness. And a lot of times it even, romanticizes the artist's struggles.
Yeah.
As if their suffering is what fuels their genius.
Exactly. And that romanticization, it's something we have to be really careful about because it can trivialize mental illness and, keep those harmful stereotypes alive. But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that some artists who have created absolutely groundbreaking work have also struggled with their mental health in significant ways. So how do we make sense of that?
Right. Yeah, that is the big question, isn't it? So let's start with Richard Dadd. Now, you mentioned earlier that he was already pretty well known, before that incident with his father.
No.
So what was his early life like? Were there any signs, anything that hinted at the darkness that was, eventually to come?
Well, Dad showed incredible talent, really from a very young age. Like,
Yeah.
he was winning awards. He was exhibiting his work while he was still a teenager. He was, especially known for his incredibly detailed, almost like photorealistic depictions of nature and historical scenes. I mean, he even got the attention of Queen Victoria. But, even in his early work, you can see hints of this fascination. A fascination with the fantastical, with the grotesque, with the, the things that make you just a little bit uneasy.
Okay, so it wasn't like this sudden shift from, happy little landscapes to these, dark, disturbing images.
No, not at all. It was more like these darker elements were always there, kind of simmering beneath the surface. And then after his trip to Egypt, they took a really sharp turn, almost as if, I don't know, the heat, the ancient ruins, being exposed to this completely different culture, somehow something cracked open inside him.
Yeah, and after that trip, his mental state, it really deteriorated, didn't it? What were his symptoms like? I mean, what was going on?
Well, he became increasingly paranoid, really withdrawn. He started having these delusions of grandeur, believing he was a descendant of Osiris, this Egyptian god. He even claimed that Osiris was, talking to him directly. This wasn't just, a quirk and eccentricity. Like, this was, a complete break with reality.
And that eventually, tragically, led to the death of his father.
It's hard to wrap your head around. How can someone who creates such beautiful art, also be capable of such a horrific act? It's a strange contrast. It's a paradox, for sure. And what makes Dad's story even more complicated is that his art, it didn't stop after he was confined to asylums. Actually, some people argue that his most compelling work, his most imaginative work, was created during that period of his life.
Oh, you're talking about the Fairy Feller's masterstroke, right? Remember, the first time I saw that painting, it's unbelievable. The detail, the colors, it's almost hallucinatory. It's beautiful, but it's also really disturbing at the same time.
Exactly, exactly. And that's why Dad is such a fascinating case study, when we're talking about this Mad Genius Thesis. I mean, was his confinement, in this strange way, actually a catalyst for his creativity? Did the structure, the routine of being in an asylum, combined with the intensity of his delusions, did that somehow unlock something? New level of artistic expression.
It's a disturbing thought, but, it does make you wonder, doesn't it? If there's some truth to the idea that genius, real genius, often thrives on the edge of chaos.
It really is. It's like you're trying to look into, a mind that's on fire, trying to make sense of a world that's just shattered. And, when I look at the Fairy Feller's masterstroke, I can't help but think of Carl Jung, and his concept of the shadow.
Oh, okay, yeah. Let's talk about that for a minute. The shadow. I've heard that term before, but I'm not sure I totally get it. So can you break that down for me a little? What exactly is the shadow, and how does it relate to, Dad's art or to this whole mad genius idea in general?
Okay, so imagine all those parts of yourself, that you try to hide, the impulses, the desires, the stuff that society says is not okay, the dark thoughts you kind of push down into your subconscious, all that's the shadow. Jung believed that everybody has one, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, it's part of who we are, like the hidden side of the moon.
So it's like our dark side, but it's not like evil, just stuff we don't want to admit to.
Right, exactly. And for artists, tapping into that shadow, it can be really powerful. I mean, think about those figures in Dad's paintings, the grotesque ones, the distorted faces, those creatures lurking in the shadows. This could be, expressions of his own shadow self, the darkness he was struggling with.
So his art becomes a way to get all that out, to give those inner demons, form, color, to make it real.
Yes, precisely. And that process, that externalization, it can be therapeutic for the artist, but it can also be really unsettling, for the viewer, because in a way it forces us to confront our own shadows, right? The stuff we'd rather not think about.
Wow. That's fascinating. So how does this idea of the shadow connect to this, broader idea of the mad genius? Are you saying that all artists, are they all, tapping into their shadow selves?
Not necessarily, but I think the artists that we tend to label as mad geniuses, they're the ones who are more willing, I guess, to go there, to explore those dark, uncharted parts of the psyche. They're not afraid to confront the ugly stuff, the disturbing stuff, the things that are taboo. And that fearlessness, it can lead to art that's truly groundbreaking, art that shakes us up, that makes us question everything.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But if the shadow is this, hidden thing, subconscious, how do artists even access it? I mean, do they just, sit around and wait for inspiration to strike, or is there a method to this?
Well, it's not always a conscious process. Jung, he believed that the shadow, it often reveals itself through symbols, through dreams, through myths, and for artists, through their work, through their creative output.
So like the mythological creatures in Dad's paintings, or the way that Van Gogh's Starry Night, it swirls, it's almost hallucinatory.
Yeah.
Are those expressions of their shadow selves? Is that what we're seeing there?
They absolutely could be. Those images, you can think of them as a way for these artists to process their inner turmoil, to give shape to the chaos that they're experiencing. And remember, both Dad and Van Gogh, they were deeply religious men. So their spiritual beliefs, they probably played a role too, in the imagery they chose and how they expressed those shadow selves.
Okay, yeah. Now it's starting to come together for me. But this whole shadow concept,
Yeah.
I mean, it can sound a little, I don't know, out there,
Yeah.
a little mystical. How do we know it's not just a bunch of psychobabble?
Well, it's important to remember that Jung, his ideas, they came from years of observing his patients, and from his own deep exploration of, the human psyche. He wasn't just making stuff up. He was seeing patterns, in the real world, in his patients, and in himself.
So there's actual substance to his theories. He wasn't just, winging it.
Exactly, yeah. And his theories, they've been influential, for decades, not just for psychologists, but for artists, for thinkers, for all sorts of people, because they offer this framework for understanding how our minds work, the conscious and the unconscious, and how that interplay shapes our creativity, how it shapes how we express ourselves.
This is making me think about Van Gogh. He's another artist who, you can't really talk about him without that Mad Genius label coming up. So how does this idea of the shadow manifest in his art? What do we see there?
Van Gogh, he's a fascinating case, isn't he? I mean, Dad was confined to those asylums, but Van Gogh, he was out there, navigating the world, grappling with his mental health while creating some of the most iconic art, in history. His life was tumultuous, failed relationships, financial struggles, and a constant battle with, what we now believe was bipolar disorder. Even his letters, they're so raw, so full of emotion and deep thought. They're almost as captivating as his paintings.
Yeah. I was reading about his time in All, in the south of France. He was so productive there. I mean, he created some of his most famous works, but he was also experiencing those intense highs and lows.
Right.
It's almost like he was chasing the light and the darkness at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And it was during this period, that he painted Starry Night, a painting that a lot of people see as this, visual representation of his inner world. All the turmoil, the struggle, I mean, the swirling sky, the vibrant colors, the way the stars seem to, dance and pulse. It's like you're seeing his heightened senses, his connection to nature, this almost mystical connection, and his struggle to find peace in all the chaos.
When I look at Starry Night, it's like I'm looking into his soul.
Yeah.
There's so much beauty, but there's also this unease. Like he's on the verge of being swallowed by the darkness. It's almost too intimate, too personal.
And that's the power of art, isn't it? It can bridge that gap, the gap between minds, between souls. It can give us these glimpses into the experiences of other people, even people who lived centuries ago. When we look at, a painting like Starry Night, we're not just seeing brushstrokes on canvas, are we? We're seeing a reflection of Van Gogh's world, his struggles, his joys, his profound connection to everything.
Yeah. So how does the shadow, how does that concept fit into our understanding of Starry Night? What does it tell us?
Well, think about that cypress tree in the foreground, the way it reaches up towards the sky. It's almost like this dark flame. Some people interpret that as, a symbol of Van Gogh's own turmoil, his struggle to reach for the light while being pulled down by the darkness.
And the sky itself, those bright stars almost exploding against the dark blue. Could that be his manic energy? The way his mind was racing between euphoria and despair.
Exactly. And then the village below. Right. It seems so small, so insignificant compared to that vast night sky. Some people see that as, a reflection of how isolated he felt, alienated from the world around him.
Wow. The more you look, the more you see. It's like, peeling back the layers of an onion. Each layer reveals something new, something profound about Van Gogh, about what was going on inside.
And that's what makes this whole, exploration so fascinating. It's not about, finding the right answer, the definitive answer. It's about asking the right questions, about digging into those complexities of, being human, and about using art, using psychology as these lenses to view the world.
This is really making me think about how we define madness.
Yeah.
It's often seen as this scary thing, something to be afraid of, something to get rid of. But what if, like you said earlier, some mental illnesses actually allow people to see things differently, to experience the world in a way that most of us don't?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it really challenges how we traditionally think about mental illness, as if it's only negative. What if that heightened sensitivity, that unconventional thinking, what if those things, the things that contribute to, mental illness, could also be the source of, extraordinary artistic vision? What if genius and madness, what if they're not two separate things? What if it's more like a spectrum?
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's a mind-blowing idea. So are we saying that to be a great artist, you have to be, mentally ill?
Yeah.
That you have to be mad to be a genius?
No. It's not that simple. It's way more nuanced than that. I mean, a lot of artists do struggle with their mental health, but not everyone who's, mentally ill is a creative genius. And we can't forget the suffering, that mental illness can cause. It's not something to be romanticized.
Of course. We can't lose sight of the human cost, but at the same time, it's fascinating to think about. What if madness is actually just a different way of seeing things? a way of accessing truths that are hidden from the rest of us.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Could what we call madness actually be a form of heightened perception, a way to see things that others can't?
That's a deep thought, a lot to unpack there. But before we get too philosophical here, I want to bring us back to to the ethical side of things. We've been talking about Dad and Van Gogh, in a pretty abstract way. But these were real people with real struggles. So how do we reconcile their brilliance, their artistic brilliance, with the difficult, the sometimes tragic realities of their lives?
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's easy to, to focus on the intellectual, the aesthetic side of their work, but we have to remember that these were people who suffered. We can't celebrate their art without acknowledging that.
Yeah.
Without acknowledging the human cost of their mental illness.
And we can't romanticize their struggles.
Yeah.
Or use their stories to justify those harmful stereotypes about mental illness.
Absolutely. The mad genius myth, it can make it seem like mental illness is a good thing, like it's a prerequisite for creativity, and that's just not true. And it can make it harder for people to get help, to get support, because there's this stigma attached to it.
So how do we find that balance? How do we appreciate the art but also respect the artist, as a person, even when their actions were disturbing or even destructive?
It's a delicate balance. It takes empathy, it takes nuance, it takes a willingness to hold those conflicting truths at the same time. We can be moved by the beauty of Dad's Fairyfeller's masterstroke, but also acknowledge the horror of his crime. We can be amazed by, the power of Van Gogh's Starry Night, and also recognize how much he suffered.
It's about seeing the whole person, right? Not just the label, not just the diagnosis. It's about understanding that creativity can come from anywhere, even in the darkest places.
Yeah, exactly. And it's about remembering that the human psyche, it's vast, it's mysterious, it's capable of, incredible beauty and profound darkness. And sometimes those two things, they're intertwined, they're inseparable.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of this, this whole topic. It's so complex, so fascinating. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway here is this. The Mad Genius Thesis, it's not some theoretical debate. It's a reflection of what it means to be human. The light and the shadow that's in all of us. It's about recognizing that potential for brilliance and for darkness that we all have.
And it's about, approaching all of that with curiosity.
Yeah.
With empathy, with a willingness to question what we think we know about what it means to be human, to be creative, to be, mad in a world that often struggles to understand anything that's different. It's funny, as we've been going through all these artists' lives, their work, I keep thinking about how we define sanity and madness.
Yeah.
Is it really that clear cut, black and white? Or is there like this gray area where genius and mental illness, they kind of coexist, maybe even, feed off each other?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And it brings up so many ethical questions too. Like if we say that Dad's mental illness, if we say that played a role in his art, in his creative output, does that excuse his crime? Does that make it okay?
That's a tough one. I mean, we can't condone violence,
right,
no matter what.
Yeah.
But can we still appreciate his art without feeling like we're saying what he did was okay?
It's a real dilemma. Art historians, critics, they've been wrestling with this for centuries. Should we separate the art from the artist? Especially in cases like Dad's where the art is so connected to his mental state, his delusions, his whole view of reality. It's all tangled up.
It makes me think about how we love this idea of the tortured artist. We celebrate the pain, the angst, the madness, like those are the things that make a true genius. But that can be dangerous.
Oh, absolutely. It trivializes mental illness, makes it seem like this glamorous thing instead of a real serious condition that needs treatment, that needs support. And it feeds that myth that you have to be mentally ill to be a great artist, which is just not true.
Right. And it can make people who are struggling, who are dealing with their own mental health issues, it can make them feel like they can't be creative, like they're not crazy enough to be a real artist.
Yeah, and that's a real shame. Creativity, it should be for everyone. It shouldn't matter, what your mental health is like. Everyone should have the chance to express themselves.
So how do how do we change that? How do we celebrate the creativity, that can come from mental illness, but without romanticizing it, without, exploiting the people who are actually living with these conditions?
Yeah.
How do we find that balance?
I think it starts with education, with breaking down the stigma, with creating a culture where people feel safe to talk about their struggles,
Hmm.
to ask for help when they need it.
Yeah, and maybe we need to rethink what we mean by genius.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this mythical thing, this unattainable quality that only a few people have. Genius can be anything. It can be in the everyday things, this small acts of creativity. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece.
I like that. Genius as a spectrum,
Mhm.
not just, yes or no. And maybe we need to rethink what we mean by madness too. What if instead of seeing it as always bad, as always negative, we try to see that it can offer a different perspective, a unique insight, something that can actually help us understand the world better.
Like how Dad's fairy pictures, that's what he called them, how they take us to this magical world, a world of fantasy, a world of imagination, or how Van Gogh's Starry Night captures the energy of the universe. It's almost spiritual.
Exactly. Their art, it gives us this window, this glimpse into minds that worked differently, minds that saw things in a way that we might not. And even though we might not always understand them, even though we might not agree with everything they did, we can still appreciate their art.
Yeah.
We can still see the beauty in it. We can still feel the power of it.
So as we wrap up, our deep dive into the Mad Genius Thesis, I think what I'm taking away is this. It's not about, finding the right answer. It's about the questions, about embracing the complexity, the contradictions, the things that make us human.
It's about recognizing that creativity, it can bloom anywhere, even in the darkest places. It's about honoring the human spirit,
Yeah.
in all its messy, contradictory glory.
And maybe, just maybe, it's about opening ourselves up to the possibility that what we call madness, maybe it's just a different way of seeing things, a different way of being, a different way of creating. And maybe, just maybe, that can help us understand what it means to be alive a little bit better.
That's a beautiful thought. And I'm on that note. I think we'll leave our listeners with that, with that thought, to ponder the mysteries of the mind and the power of art. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep embracing all the complexities of what it means to be human.